was made possible by Organic Valley. The FAFO, Farmers Advocating for Organics, you may not know what that is, but basically there's a group of Organic Valley farmers that are on a board, and so we were awarded money by Organic Valley farmers. They decided that they wanted this to be a priority, and therefore we are here today. And there's a lot that goes into that. So it's a partnership between UW-Madison, UW Extension, and Organic Valley, and we're basically trying to build capacity for these topics and training capacity. Our overall goal is, in the end, obviously, to preserve and increase organic acreage by helping current and future farmers to be successful and profitable. And you're on the front lines of this, so you're out there doing outreach and helping these farmers become better pasture management specialists and health animal specialists, so you're helping them with their herd and their grass. And we all know that to be a good organic farmer, you have to have good grass management, because if you're not good at managing your grass, then there's going to be some holes in your system. So we're here to do that today. And yeah, so we have evaluations at the end today, so we really appreciate that you take time to complete those. Some of it's going to be oral and some of it's going to be on paper. But we need your help developing these sessions for next year when we do more. And we also are focusing on how we can help UW researchers and other Organic Valley staff learn about what topics need more attention for future research, more outreach. So it's not just for these trainings, but also for helping with future organic research, organic pasture management research. I just want to give you a little background before we go into our panel today on what we've done already in the project. So last year and the first part of this year, we had a grad student in our agroecology master's program at UW. Her name is Brittany Isadora, and she's here today. Wave for everybody. With Dick Cates and Randy Jackson, who's a grassland ecologist at UW, they basically conducted a literature review of any of the existing training resources that were out there, but also research findings. So the literature review, we're hoping to get to you later this fall, so you'll get a final copy of that before the new year that will go into detail about what we uncovered. The Cliff Notes version is essentially this. So far, virtually there's no literature out there addressing how organic management influences perennial pasture ecosystems, if that makes sense. So there's only a few research papers out there that address those specific questions about organic management of perennial pasture. There were a lot of articles, as you might have already figured out, on organic management of annual systems, so like corn, beans, stuff like that. I've been researched quite a bit. And so this doesn't, so the evidence out there is that so far in these few research papers, mind you, there's no fundamental difference in the soil or plant dynamics in pastures managed organically versus non-organically. And that does not mean there are not differences, it just means in these two papers, those are the conclusions. So basically, with these trainings now in mind, we're going ahead with the assumption that the grazing management principles that are developed for non-organic pastures are recommended for organic pastures, so long as organic standards are also being met, right? And that's what we're going to talk about, the organic standards too. So basic managed grazing principles are what we're going forward with today. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome our panelists, and any of you don't know any of them, maybe you haven't been in this for that long. These guys have been around for a long time. And Alfred Kuzenbaum is a retired Organic Valley farmer, you may not know that, but and he is now the DGA Education Coordinator. So the Dairy Grazing Apprenticeship is the first apprenticeship in agriculture in the nation. They have them in Europe, but this is the first one in the US. So neat organization. And Vance Haugen is currently dairy farming with his family and his son, and was recently, or for a long time, the university extension agent in many counties. I don't even know how many counties, but just a few. It seems like you were everywhere, Vance. You were like in every single county.
I worked in every single county, but I was only based out of 2 counties.
So recently retired as well. And Kevin Yankee is our Organic Valley farmer at this moment, and you're also OB milk specialist, right?
Yes, working milk quality as well.
Quality as well, okay. And this is his farm, so thank you. And Jean Schrieffer grazing, wonderfully so. So yeah, if you haven't been to his farm, you should go check it out too. And yeah, so we'd like to start today with our kennel, and we actually had a phone conversation a while back about some things getting in the dry matter you think you are. And we're talking about pasture dry matter, we're also talking about other types of ways you might feed your cows. So I thought that I would start with a few questions, and we can go from there, and then if there seems to be a lull, I'll bring up some more. But we talked a lot, since we had this conversation back in August, we talked a lot about heat stress and how that affects dry matter intake for the cattle, and then also how heat stress causes decreased growth in pasture plants, so in the grasses and legumes. And you do have a handout on your table that refers to legume estimation, percentage of pasture, which we'll go into in a little bit, but I thought we'd just start with those basic topics that I just brought up, and people on the panel here want to address them, or if there's another burning question related to this, please just raise your hand and we'll go from there. So once again, that's heat stress for cattle and heat stress for grasses and legumes and how they're affected in terms of dry matter intake. So start there, and I'm going to just grab this chair. Who would like to talk a little bit first about the effects of those things?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit about heat stress in cattle, and maybe Jean had a comment on our phone call about heat stress in the pasture sward. Heat stress in dairy cattle, I feel, in grazing in general, not just in organic grazing, but it's something that has over the last 20, 25 years not really gotten sufficient attention. Obviously, we're taking animals out of a confinement system, out of a shaded barn of some sort, and put them out on grass. And really, if we're honest about it, here in Wisconsin, southern Wisconsin in particular, for a good portion of the year, it's getting hot out there. And early on in the grazing movement, when we tried to do everything exactly the same like in New Zealand, and later on when we talk about pasture dry matter, it's very interesting. This is a very early grazing stick from the early 90s. It tells you how to graze. Here's a more recent one, sponsored by Organic Valley. And you see even the differences on the grazing stick and what we have learned about grazing over those last 25 years. But in terms of shade, early on, we thought, cows are just fine. They don't need shade, and shade just helps congregate them in the pasture, and they poop and get dirty. But I know there are some of you in the audience who are inspectors out on organic farms. I see a lot of suffering out there of animals on pasture. So I think it's something that we have to mitigate and take into account. And actually, many graziers, organic graziers in particular, where animal welfare is of much greater concern in our organic systems due to our standards, we have come to provide some sort of relief to the animals. And for many that looks like that the cows go out in their regular rotation after morning milking for maybe 3 hours or so, and then as it starts heating up towards the middle of the day, you bring them back to the facilities. You have ample water for them, you have shade for them, maybe even importantly some palatable stored feed like baleage or so to keep the dry matter consumption up. And that's where heat stress and the subject of today, do you get the dry matter you think you're getting, where that really comes together. Because as it gets hot, the cows are bunching up, which even exacerbates the heat stress by the proximity of the cattle. And that is just a natural herd instinct. Whenever a herding animal perceives stress, they want to come together as a herd, because that's where they feel there's protection for them, be that flies, or be it predators, or be it heat in this case. So by bringing them to the facilities, they can cool off. Other measures might be that in a holding area of a parlor, you might want to install a very inexpensive sprinkler system, coupled with fans that provides evaporative cooling of the animals. In short, during the hottest time of the day, keep the animals off the pasture, and then after the evening milking, turn them back out for night grazing. So that's a model that has really gotten a lot of foothold among organic dairies. And all I'm saying is here, with the heat stress, not only is it an animal welfare concern, but you also will see significant milk production losses due to a reduced dry matter intake.
Thanks, Alfred. Any other comments on cattle or grasses, legumes?
Just a quick follow-up on Alfred's comments. I've certainly seen that. I just had the opportunity to do a pasture walk up in by Plainview, Minnesota with Michelle and Roger Benrud, and I believe they ship to Organic Valley. They're grass milk producers at any rate, and that was exactly the strategy that they were using. They would bring the animals off, bring them back to a building that had shade, and then hopefully that they could put some high quality, or at least very decent quality feed in front of them. And in their particular case, since they were grass milk producers, obviously it was some type of grass product, they were having some issues, of course. So you solve one problem and you create another. And the heat stress, they seem to be solving that, but they were having some real significant issues with cleanliness on the animals, and they thought there was some mastitis issues related to some of that strategy. Another strategy that I've seen people use, instead of bringing them back to the buildings, of course, if you have paddocks that have shade in them, you can set your best paddocks up for early morning when it should be relatively cool. Let the animals graze for 2, 3, 4 hours. What I would suggest, and rather than you choosing when the animals move out, if you have lane systems, which almost everyone that would have milk cattle would have lane systems, have the lanes set up so that when the cattle choose, I think that's stressful, just like Alfred said, they'll choose to bunch up. And if they're starting to bunch up, then they can go into the lane, they can follow themselves back to where the shade paddocks are. The disadvantage, of course, is that if your shade paddocks are not optimum, you could reduce your dry matter, not only reduce your dry matter intake, but you could have quality issues with that. But from a labor standpoint, that's the other thing that we run into, is that, in general, but not always, in general, unlimited desires and limited resources, that's the definition of economics. That's generally what farmers have. They generally have too much work to do. And so making it so it's relatively easy, that would be something that I would suggest, a possible method.
Yeah, we're going to get into later about the issues with the shade. We talked about in our conversation, and making sure that the shade is adequate in other ways too. And Gene has some comments about that, I know, later. But yeah, let's go back to,
I'll add one more thing not to repeat everything that they had said. Another strategy, digestion of fiber creates heat. So the cow's natural instinct is to eat less because they're already hot. So one thing that we've done in Iowa County with some of our organic grazers is we're planting a specific summer annual that's got a little bit higher digestibility, higher energy. And in some of 2012 was a prime example where the cattle were bunched up by 8 o'clock in the morning, you turn them loose and they're already bunched up.
Right.
The farms that were using sorghum, Sudan, brown midward types, Sudan grasses, and brown midward traits, the cattle went out and grazed their full grazing in the morning, and then came back and found shade. So not every farm wants to till, that's fine, but thinking about specific crops that can keep intake up, that don't produce the level of heat that our traditional grass forages do, helps the cow become more comfortable. Here in the Southwest, for those of us that are from here, Kevin's farm is a prime example. I like to plan paddocks for shade and graze them early in the spring before they leaf out, and then allow that grass to it's not going to be high quality dairy feed, but it's a place for the cows to go where they can relax and have a little bit more comfort. And if we don't need it, we can still graze it as young cow if it's a cool, comfortable summer.
Yeah, so I'm Kevin Dockey. So we're on the grass milk truck, and one of the things that we really noticed is that through the summer, if I don't continuously focus on the cow's dry matter intake and the heat stress, I see it immediately on the dipstick. I give it a drop. So I kind of use that as a gauge of where we're at. And like Gene said, well, one thing that we employ is once we get into the hot times of the year, I just go into what I call drought mode. So for instance, I don't graze my pastures too short, so I leave high residue. But the other thing is I always in the back of my mind have all these shade pastures that are just sitting there for when I look at the weather and they say, 100-degree heat index for the next 4 days starting Thursday. So then I say, okay, well, I'm going to go here Thursday, there Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And so I've got these pastures that are just sitting there waiting for whenever the weather dictates that I need it. Now, if you get into a stretch of lots and lots of hot days, you'll end up trashing them, but it's still a way to get your cows cooled down. And the nice thing about that is when the cows are under the shade tree, if you've got pasture close by, you just go out and give them 20-foot breaks of some good high-quality pasture, even if it's 100 degrees. If one goes, they'll all go because they can't stand there and watch the other cows eating while they're in the shade. So they'll all go out and eat for an hour, and then filter back and stand under the shade. And if you've got water somewhere else, not in the shade, it'll be like this triangle of cows. And if you just go out every 2 hours and move that fence a little bit, you'll just have a constant rotation of cows that are cool and fed, and you've got water, and they're all doing it within 100 yards.
It's like a merry-go-round.
Yeah.
There you go.
And then one other thing I'd like to throw out is I invented this thing called a pasture mister. So I've got water in all my pastures, and I've got faucets set up, so I'm always within a few hundred feet of the faucet. So this pasture mixture is just as simple as a 20-foot 2x4 with
USDA developed something called the heat stress forecast, and if you have your GPS enabled on your phone, it'll tell us whether we're having a heat stress event. It's a temperature and humidity based, and it's based on data out of Nebraska who developed it. It's free download. You just need a good data connection to actually get that. And you can see most of the country is green today, so we're not expecting any heat stress. But in July and August, this thing was turning pretty red because of the humidity that we had a few times. So that's just a handy thing that we can use or farmers can find. I think most farmers have phones of some sort, hopefully a smartphone, and hopefully a data plan. Do we want to talk about grass stress?
There's a comment here.
Can I ask a question?
Of course, yeah, of course. Yeah.
I've been racking my brain on this one. Is there a threshold on how many days a year when there's heat stress that's economical? Because everybody's asking us, can we put it in shade stress if we have enough of a concern? Do you have an idea? I mean, if you look at the Texas charts, Nebraska charts, maybe we have 30 days where we're over that, 70% humidity and 85 degrees. If you talk to some people with dairy cows, it's over 70 degrees, and that means we have 60 days of that. Beef cows and dairy cows are probably a little bit different. So if you've got an idea what that threshold is, I'd like to know it.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that, or put that comment and question together, Brian. One of the things that I wanted to also emphasize is that there have been some more recent studies on heat stress, particularly for dairy animals. Now, it wasn't pastured animals per se that I'm aware of those studies. But what I have been what I think was quite interesting is that the numbers that these studies found, that cattle had more problems earlier than what we in the past would have predicted. So before, it was somewhere around the 80 or 85 degrees, we were saying that cattle would get in trouble depending on the humidity. Now, we're saying that we can actually measure reduction in production down into that 75 area with humidity. And I'm not suggesting that every time it's 75 you gotta, you know, get real creative about things. However, what I will say is that I think all three touched on this, I think a lot of people have kind of said, well, it's just not that big a deal. When you take a look at least what, within those studies, what their milk reduction, the reduction in milk production, excuse me, it was fairly significant. And so, you know, then I think we should take this a little bit, I think we should be a little bit more proactive on some of these things. On the other hand, I want to be a little bit careful, because I think Kevin really hit on it too. You know, I mentioned it also. We don't want to create problems in solving something else, or just throwing money at it. And again, not a dig or anything against like a shade haven or whatever. But sometimes I take a look at some of those things, and I think we can have some problems. And I look at Don Austin back there, and I say, well, you know, sometimes where you plant your trees are probably, you know, I have a disagreement with the way that Don does it. And you know, again, it's his farm, and he can do anything he wants. But sometimes you will create problems by solving some of the other things. However, reducing heat stress in cattle is a good thing to do in general.
Yeah, we make sure we have time to talk about the lone tree in the pasture where all the animals,
Okay, yeah.
which he'll talk about in a minute. So, but yeah, let's go back to having, we talked about this, actually you mentioned having enough residual after each grazing event so that the soil stays cool enough and so that the grasses regrow and that you're preventing erosion, those sorts of issues with having it be too hot essentially for the grasses and legumes. So talk a little bit about the pasture now and shift from the cows, if we could, for a few minutes. Any comments on?
I'll jump in on that one.
Absolutely.
That was, 2012 was kind of an instructive year for folks that have been grazing for a long time. We've always thought about drought unless we're grazing through 1988 drought. We weren't sure.
Some of us were.
Some of you were. I was not. I was just getting going. But, you know, as much as you read, and I think you understand if you actually experience it, you're not sure if you're doing it right. So you have to go through a drought once in a while just to understand it. But I was working on another project and I was measuring soil temperatures, because if you remember July of 2012, at least down the southern part of the state, I'm going to say we had 30 days over 90 degrees. I think we had about 10 days over 100. And on one of those days, I was out measuring some soil temperatures in a field of sunflowers and corn. And at 2.5, 3 inches, I was recording over 100-degree soil temperatures, which is pretty damn hot. And then I thought, I wonder what's going on in pastures. And I've never used my soil thermometer in a pasture before, and was just curious. So I went on my farm, which I had permission to walk across, I have to talk to you. And where we had nice, tall orchard grass, red clover stands, kind of not a fancy pasture, just a traditional beef pasture. I was recording 80-degree soil temperatures at 2.5 inches. Went to the fence line where my neighbor is, where it's more like this tabletop, and bluegrass, whatever else was growing, and we still had over 100-degree soil temperatures. And I started bringing my soil probe or soil thermometer out to some pasture lots that summer, and everywhere where we had less than that 1 inch residual, we were seeing these 20 to 25-degree higher soil temperatures. And so then my question was, well, we're trying to grow cool season grasses, what's the optimum temperature? And it's, 50 to 70 degrees soil temperature is about optimum for cool season grasses. If you start getting warmer than that, they start to slow down. As they get over 90, they shut down totally, and they don't grow. So anyhow, the idea of grazing height, residual forage, and the impact of shade on the soil creates a microclimate. And if we graze heights, we're losing water because we've got evaporative losses, we've got solar radiation, and we've got wind that's getting down right to that soil surface, pulling moisture off. When we keep proper grazing heights out there, start heights and finish heights, we create a more favorable microclimate for those grasses to thrive. When we think about cow comfort, there's also grass comfort that's part of it. And then that might lead to the discussion of, should we think about warm season grasses for certain areas of our farms that are more adapted to these maybe intense summer periods, whether it's an annual or a perennial warm season grass that doesn't mind it when soil temperatures hit 90 or more.
Thank you, Gene. Any questions from everybody here or comments from the panelists?
I talked about how I treat my pastures in the summer. So yeah, ever since 2012, I kind of have this, I call it drought mode, where the switch goes on in my head. And it can happen actually this year, early on in the year, we got about 6 weeks where it was getting pretty dry. And so as a rotational grazer, you can really easily tell the soil moisture because you're pushing posts in the ground multiple times a day. Moving 3 groups of cattle, I might be moving 8 fences in one given day all over the farm. So in your head, you take in all this data of when does it rain last, how long. And so when that drought mode switch goes on, what I do is pull off of the pastures and graze them somewhere else to give those pastures a longer rest time. So I'll stretch the rest periods out from maybe a 20-day rotation in the spring. All of a sudden then into July and August, I might be out to a 40, 50, even 60-day rotation if I need it. And then so what else the other thing I do then is incorporate grazing sedan grass. So he mentioned a summer annual. So on the fields that I outwinter my cattle on, that spring, I'll just disc it up and plant sedan grass. And that is my reserve pasture for when the summer pastures start to slump down. And so typically what I'll do then, and to avoid the heat stress to the animals as well, is I'll graze those fields at night because typically those are what was cropland originally on the farm, so it's just wide open with no trees. So I graze the sedan grass at night, and then when I move on to my pastures during the day, just by pulling the sedan grass into that grazing mix, I've doubled my pasture rotation. And so leaving a high residual through those dry months is really just good insurance. I mean, you keep the ground covered, you keep all the bioactivity going. And orchard grass, generally, even if it gets pretty hot out, it'll slow down. But if you keep the roots cold and keep them wet, shaded, you can easily graze. I mean, I've been grazing sedan grass this summer like crazy, but this is not a typical summer. But yeah, residual is the key. And really, after many years of doing this, really the only time that you ever really want to graze a pasture short is in the spring because you can get away with it because plants are there's so many hours of sunlight and moisture that you just can't beat it back. And then the other time is if you've got a pasture that is in need of some renovation. For instance, if you want to do frost seeding or no-till, the best time is to go into that field in the fall and just beat the heck out of it. Graze it too often, too short, too many times. So that, just looks like you could put golf balls across it, and then it's ready for seed.
Yeah, and that's great. I was going to forget to mention though, we aren't going to talk much about weeds today per se, wasn't our agenda, but that is something that's in one of the resources we gave you is a little bit about how higher residual can also help the organic system keep the weeds at bay. And so there's some data in one of the publications there to look at. And hopefully a future topic next year will be weeds, but that is another thing about residual and trying to keep weeds out of it. But go ahead, answer that first.
Kevin, what's your ideal residual on your farm, spring aside, before you turn the drought switch on and after you turn the drought switch on?
Oh, that's a good question.
Roughly.
Well, right now, because there's so much forage out there and they're grazing stuff that if you straighten it up tall, it's probably pushing 16 inches tall. So when it gets to a certain height where it starts to fall over a little bit, then there really is no residual height because it's all trampled in. So depending on the height of when you turn them in, if it's gotten ahead of them where it's too tall, there really won't be residual. There's either eat whatever they ate or the rest is just flattened down, trampled in. But through the summer and a clean pasture that's got uniform growth, I like to turn in about a foot and pull out about 6 inches. Just graze the tops off. And then that's going to depend. I also use the leader follower system. So I'm following my milk cows with a group of heifers and some nurse cows and calves. So that also affects, I stand in the pasture to decide how big to put it. Not only am I deciding how much forage I need for my cows every 12 hours, but I also have to take into consideration after I pull my cows out, I'm putting 40 more head in there for another few days until I get through the next pasture that I can bounce them through. Really, I don't really concern myself too much about the residual height. It's more of just trying to keep the cattle moved around and then have an adequate rest period. Because the rest period will fix anything that you mess up when you graze. If you graze too short, if the weather's not brutal out, you'll just need a longer rest period to get back to where you gotta be. And if you've got enough pasture and rotation, that's okay to do.
Question, Rosie?
I was just curious, Kevin, how many total head and how many total acres are you grazing with?
So the home farm that we're on is 190 acres, and then we rent another 40 right next to us that's basically just hay production. And so we've got 80 milk cows and about 30 heifers and then about 30 yearling heifers. And so out of that 189 acres on the home farm here, there's probably about 30 acres of that that's kind of woods and just wasteland. And then about another 50 acres that's just permanent rough pasture that I can't get equipment in, like an old savanna type deal. And then the rest of it is just all cropland that was taken out of, some of it was taken out of crop production and just made into pasture. And then the rest of the cropland is just hay made in the beginning of the year and then total pasture now. So from right now till the end of the year, I'll be grazing on 200 acres.
Yeah, and I'm sure Kevin will talk more about leader follower when we get out of the pasture if you're in his group. I know Bill is going to mention something that always kind of irks him sometimes going out to inspections, which he mentioned at one point, was just that you have not just your lactating dairy cattle out there. Obviously, you have other cows on your farm that need pasture as well, and sometimes farmers are focused on feeding their dairy cattle and not so focused on feeding their dry cows or their heifers. And so the idea of livestock class and making sure that you have enough dry matter for every single animal, not just the dairy cows. And I think that's important that we touch on that at some point today. It might not be right now, but if anybody has any comments on that too throughout the day.
I want to make a real quick comment on the idea of using sorghums or sorghum sedans. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Basically it's a warm season grass. So you can fill in some of those holes. It can be a great insurance for drought. But I also want to make sure that you don't forget that you can also drill in corn. And especially organic producers, the corn that you have, you can plant it legally. And it's no problem with that. You can drill it in. And then if you want to get multiple grazings or if you want to get it later in the season, you don't have to worry about frost, so there's no prussic acid poisoning issues. And that's one of the things, when I worked up in Shawano County, which is near Green Bay, it's the only time I ever saw prussic acid poisoning on a group of heifers. They were not grazed, they were green chopped, but they killed, I think, 15 or 20 of them. And so I've always been really touchy on that. And so the other part of it is that corn is also really, really a forgiving plant. Drill it in 6, 7, or 8 inch rows, whatever you got, and put 100 to 120,000 plants per acre. Just bin run right out of your bin. And I'll tell you what, I'll put that up against any sorghum or sorghum sedan for both quality and tonnage. And again, nothing wrong with that. And if you, like Gene was saying, with the brown midrib, I think it's really important to get some high quality. But one of the things to remember on corn production, they've bred all kinds of stuff into it for the ear, for grain production. But they haven't been able to screw up yet. It's probably coming, but they haven't been able to screw up the growth before it puts on the ear. So if you take a look at some of the work that was done here in Wisconsin on 140 some different varieties, up until the ear comes out, the quality was the same. So, and it was very good quality. Just something to think about.
Do you no-till that in, or do you have to till it?
Well, organically, you might want to do some tillage for weed control. Conventionally, we could just take a graze or hay and then no-till it.
Right, but like Kevin was saying too, you can graze the snot out of something. I mean, if it's an area that you're thinking about renovating anyway, get an early grazing on it, get a really tight, maybe a light disking, maybe 2 light diskings, come out and then put in your, and then the other hand, you can say, I want to put sorghum in, or pearl millet, or whatever you want to do, fine. Those are all, they're okay things, but don't overlook that, if you've got corn already in your farm, if you are producing corn, and not everybody does that, but if you are, there's something that's a resource you can use, it's already on your farm.
In the essence of time, we have about 15 minutes before we go out. I want to make sure we get a couple things covered that we wanted to do.